The thin line of mist hung like a ghostly veil above the jungle floor. Dawn had barely broken on September 17, 1944, but already the air on Peleliu Island shimmered with oppressive heat. Marine Sergeant Marcellus Jenkins lay motionless in his hastily constructed hide, the stock of his M1903 Springfield rifle pressed firmly against his shoulder. His dark skin glistened with sweat and camouflage paint as he peered through his scope at the Japanese position 800 yards away. The island's distinctive coral ridge, what the Marines had grimly nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge, loomed before him, its caves and tunnels hiding an enemy that refused to surrender. With methodical precision, Jenkins adjusted his weapon, calculating the wind that blew steadily from left to right across the battlefield. He knew this shot would be nearly impossible under normal circumstances. The target was partially sheltered behind coral, and the crosswinds were gusting at 25 miles per hour. But Jenkins wasn't using normal techniques. His finger caressed the trigger as he aimed not at the Japanese machine gun nest itself, but at a point nearly 20 yards to the left. 17 degrees off center, he whispered to the Marine spotter beside him. Wind correction factor of 3.8. When he squeezed the trigger, the rifle bucked against his shoulder. The .30-06 round spiraled out of the barrel, caught the powerful crosswind, and curved, almost impossibly, along a bending trajectory that carried it directly into the hidden Japanese position. The enemy machine gun fell silent. Behind him, a radio crackled to life. Box hole 3 to Jenkins, confirm hit. Jenkins didn't immediately answer. Instead, he chambered another round and prepared for his next shot. 2,000 Marines of the 1st Division were pinned down below, unable to advance across the exposed coral field. His unorthodox technique, what would later become known as the bent bullet method, was their only hope. No one in the 5th Marine Depot Company knew that one man's defiance of conventional marksmanship that morning would rewrite battlefield history, save thousands of lives, and forever change sniper warfare. Marcellus Jenkins was born on March 7, 1921 in Clarksdale, Mississippi, the second son of a Baptist minister and a schoolteacher. His childhood unfolded against the harsh backdrop of the Jim Crow South, where opportunity for a young black man seemed as distant as the moon. His father, Reverend Josiah Jenkins, preached about perseverance and faith on Sundays, but spent weekdays working the cotton fields to support his family of 6. His mother, Abigail, taught at the colored school in town, instilling in young Marcellus a love of mathematics and physics that would later serve him in ways none could have imagined. My father always told me that a man's worth isn't measured by how others treat him, but by how he conducts himself when no one important is watching, Jenkins would later recall in a 1979 interview for the Veterans History Project. He believed education was the only ticket out of Mississippi, and he made sure we all understood that. By age 12, Jenkins had developed an uncanny talent for hunting. Food was scarce during the Great Depression, and his family relied on whatever game he could bring home. Using his grandfather's weathered Winchester rifle, he became known throughout Coahoma County for his ability to hit moving targets at distances that seemed impossible for someone so young. The wind was always blowing across those cotton fields, Jenkins explained. I learned early that if you want to hit something far away, you've got to understand how the air moves between you and your target. Most folks aim directly at what they wanted to hit. I knew better. This intuitive understanding of ballistics would have likely remained nothing more than a hunting skill if not for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. When America entered World War II, Jenkins was 20 years old and attending Tuskegee Institute on a partial scholarship, studying mathematics and engineering. The son of a World War I veteran, he felt an immediate call to serve. But in 1942, the United States Marine Corps had never accepted a black recruit. For 167 years, the Corps had remained exclusively white. This changed on June 1, 1942, when President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which prohibited racial discrimination in the defense industry and federal government, including the armed forces. Jenkins was among the first African Americans to enlist in the Marine Corps that summer. He and thousands of other black recruits were sent to Montford Point, a segregated training facility adjacent to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. The conditions were primitive compared to those at the main base: swampy, mosquito-infested land with hastily constructed plywood huts and limited facilities. They didn't want us there, and they made sure we knew it, Jenkins would later write in his unpublished memoirs. We couldn't enter the main camp without a white escort. We trained with cast-off equipment. But we were determined to prove ourselves as Marines, even if they only saw us as laborers. The first day at Montford Point established the tone for what would follow. As Jenkins and 73 other black recruits stepped off the bus, they were met not with the traditional Marine Corps greeting, but with stony silence from the white officers. Their initial barracks were little more than wooden shells with leaking roofs and minimal sanitation facilities. The training grounds consisted of marshy fields that flooded with each rainfall, turning routine exercises into grueling tests of endurance. We slept on cots with thin mattresses, while white recruits at the main camp had proper beds, recalled Raymond Wilkins, another member of Jenkins's training cohort. Our mess hall served food that was always a day older than what the white Marines got, but not one man complained. We knew that's what they wanted, for us to quit. The training at Montford Point was grueling, designed, some believed, to force black recruits to quit. But Jenkins and his fellow recruits endured, driven by the chance to serve their country despite the indignities of segregation. Drill instructors like Sergeant Gilbert Hashmark Johnson and Sergeant Edgar Huff, themselves black Marines, pushed the recruits to exceed all standards. Johnson would say, "You've got to be twice as good as any white Marine just to be considered half as good," Jenkins recalled, "so that's exactly what we set out to be." The regimen was brutal. 16-hour days filled with physical training, weapons instruction, and endless drills. Jenkins excelled in every area, but particularly in marksmanship. During rifle qualification, he scored 48 out of 50 possible points, a score that would have earned recognition in any regular Marine unit, but went largely unacknowledged at Montford Point. "When I hit 10 bullseyes in a row during qualification, the range officer checked my target 3 times, Jenkins later said. He was convinced I must have been firing at someone else's target by mistake. The idea that a black man could shoot that well seemed impossible to him. Despite the skepticism, Jenkins's scores couldn't be denied. He completed his basic training in October 1942 and was assigned to the 5th Marine Depot Company. The Marine Corps had decided that most black Marines would serve in segregated depot and ammunition companies, support roles, rather than combat positions. These units were responsible for loading and unloading ships, transporting supplies, and maintaining ammunition stores. Essential, but unglamorous work far from the front lines. Yet Jenkins's exceptional marksmanship had not gone unnoticed. During rifle qualification, he had scored near-perfect marks, outperforming many of the instructors. One white officer, Captain Robert Hardwick, took particular interest in Jenkins's skills. "I've never seen anyone shoot like you," Hardwick told him after watching Jenkins hit 10 consecutive bullseyes at 300 yards. "Where did you learn to compensate for wind like that?" "Mississippi cotton fields, sir," Jenkins replied. "The wind never stops blowing there." Hardwick made an unusual decision. Though Jenkins would remain officially assigned to the 5th Marine Depot Company, the captain began providing him with additional marksmanship training after hours, using his own influence to secure ammunition and range time. Jenkins absorbed everything: trajectory calculations, range estimation, breath control. But it was his intuitive understanding of wind effects that truly set him apart. "Most marksmen see wind as an obstacle to overcome," Hardwick observed. "Jenkins sees it as a tool to exploit." This additional training occurred away from the scrutiny of those who might object to a black Marine receiving specialized instruction. 3 times a week, Jenkins would report to the firing range after completing his regular duties. There, Hardwick and occasionally other sympathetic instructors would work with him on advanced techniques, normally reserved for scout sniper training. The captain would set up these impossible shots, Jenkins recalled. Targets partially hidden behind barriers, extreme ranges, or in gusting crosswinds. He'd ask how I would approach each one, and then we'd test my theories. Sometimes I was wrong, but more often I was right, especially about the wind. Jenkins particularly excelled at what snipers called reading the wind, the ability to detect subtle changes in air movement and calculate their effect on a bullet's trajectory. Where most marksmen used visual cues like mirage or vegetation movement to estimate wind speed at the firing position, Jenkins developed techniques to evaluate wind conditions along the entire path of the bullet. Wind isn't uniform, he explained to Hardwick during one session. It changes speed and direction as it moves across terrain. If you only account for the wind where you're standing, your bullet will go wide when it hits different wind conditions downrange. This insight, revolutionary at the time, led Jenkins to develop his own system for predicting wind effects across varied terrain. He would observe multiple indicators, dust movement, vegetation motion, heat mirage, at different distances and mentally construct a complete wind map between his position and the target. Then, instead of simply compensating for wind drift, he would deliberately use the wind to guide his bullet along a curved path to the target. By early 1944, Jenkins had become proficient with the M1903 Springfield rifle, fitted with an 8-power Unertl scope, the primary sniper weapon of the Marine Corps. Though never formally designated as a sniper due to the racial restrictions of the time, he had developed skills that rivaled or exceeded those of the Corps' official sniper school graduates. When the 5th Marine Depot Company received orders to deploy to the Pacific in May 1944, Jenkins went with them, still officially a supply handler, but carrying the additional burden of his specialized training. Captain Hardwick, now assigned to the intelligence section of the 1st Marine Division, ensured that Jenkins's rifle and scope traveled with him. An unusual privilege for a Marine in a depot company. This is against regulations, Hardwick admitted as he signed the requisition forms. But regulations don't win wars. Men like you do. The Pacific War in 1944 was entering a new phase. American forces were advancing across the Central Pacific toward Japan, capturing strategic islands in what became known as the Island Hopping Campaign. Each conquest brought Allied forces closer to the Japanese homeland, but at tremendous cost in American lives. The island hopping strategy had been devised as a means of bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions while capturing islands essential for establishing air bases and supply depots. By 1944, the campaign had advanced through the Solomon Islands and was pushing into the Central Pacific. The Japanese, recognizing the strategic implications of this advance, had shifted from their earlier offensive mindset to a defensive posture focused on making each island conquest as costly as possible for American forces. As a result, islands that might once have been considered minor objectives became scenes of intense combat. Japanese defenders, following their Bushido code that considered surrender dishonorable, would fight to the death rather than capitulate. They constructed elaborate defensive networks, bunkers, tunnels, and interlocking fields of fire that maximized the advantages of terrain and minimized the impact of American superiority in naval and air power. Jenkins's unit first saw action at Saipan in June 1944. Though depot companies were supposed to remain in rear areas managing supplies, the chaotic nature of the Pacific Island battles often thrust them into combat. On Saipan, the 5th Marine Depot Company came ashore with the second wave and immediately found themselves under fire from Japanese snipers and mortars. We landed carrying ammunition boxes, but within an hour we were carrying rifles instead, Jenkins later recounted. No one cared about the color of our skin once the shooting started. The Battle of Saipan was particularly brutal. Japanese forces, recognizing the strategic importance of the Mariana Islands, fought with unprecedented determination. The island's varied terrain, from beaches to mountains, sugarcane fields to dense jungle, created constantly changing combat conditions that tested the adaptability of all Marine units. For the 5th Marine Depot Company, what began as a logistical mission quickly evolved into a combat role. As Japanese forces launched counterattacks against the American beachhead, every available Marine, regardless of primary assignment, was pressed into defensive positions. It was during the Saipan campaign that Jenkins first demonstrated his exceptional marksmanship in combat. After a Japanese sniper had killed 3 Marines from concealed positions in the dense foliage, Jenkins volunteered to hunt down the threat. Using techniques learned from Captain Hardwick, he located and neutralized the sniper from 400 yards away, a shot made more remarkable by the gusting winds and limited visibility. He spent maybe 15 minutes just watching the tree line, remembered Corporal Donovan Pierce, who had accompanied Jenkins as a spotter, not looking through his scope, just observing with his naked eyes. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was mapping the wind patterns. Then he made this single shot, an impossible shot given the conditions, and we confirmed the kill. The incident, though never officially recorded, spread by word of mouth through the battalion. Several company commanders began requesting that Black Marine sharpshooter when their units faced entrenched Japanese positions that conventional tactics couldn't overcome. Captain Hardwick, leveraging his position in the division intelligence section, facilitated these unofficial assignments, ensuring that Jenkins's skills were utilized where they could make the most difference. In one particularly notable action, on the 8th day of the Saipan campaign, Jenkins eliminated a Japanese artillery observer who had been directing devastating fire onto American positions. The observer was concealed in a cave opening on a cliff face nearly 600 yards from the nearest viable firing position. The shot required not only extraordinary accuracy, but an understanding of how the prevailing winds would affect the bullet as it traveled across a deep valley. I watched him prepare for that shot, Captain Hardwick later wrote in a personal letter. He didn't calculate windage in the traditional sense. Instead, he deliberately aimed at a point well to the left of the target, almost 30 feet off center. When I questioned this, he explained that he wasn't trying to overcome the wind, but rather using it to curve the bullet into the cave opening. The shot succeeded exactly as he predicted. Word of Jenkins's skill spread quietly among the officers of the 1st Marine Division. Though official recognition was limited due to the segregated nature of the Corps, Jenkins found himself increasingly called upon for special assignments requiring marksmanship. Still, these were ad hoc arrangements, unofficial acknowledgments of his value rather than formal recognition of his abilities. By the conclusion of the Saipan campaign in July 1944, Jenkins had been credited, unofficially, with 28 enemy kills, a number that would have earned formal recognition had he been a white Marine in a designated combat unit. Instead, he returned to his regular duties with the Depot Company as the division prepared for its next objective. The true test of Jenkins's skills would come 3 months later on Peleliu, one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The Battle of Peleliu began on September 15, 1944, when the 1st Marine Division landed on the southwestern beaches of the small coral island. The Japanese defenders, entrenched in an elaborate network of caves, tunnels, and concrete bunkers, resisted fiercely. The Marines had expected to secure the island within 4 days. Instead, they faced over 2 months of brutal combat in debilitating heat that reached 115 degrees. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had implemented a new defensive strategy that abandoned the costly banzai charges of earlier island battles in favor of a war of attrition fought from carefully prepared positions. Rather than contesting the beaches directly, Japanese forces withdrew to the island's central ridges, rugged coral formations that provided natural defensive advantages and had been enhanced with artificial fortifications. This strategy negated many traditional American strengths. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment proved largely ineffective against the deeply entrenched Japanese positions. tanks struggled to maneuver in the broken coral terrain, and infantry assaults faced devastating fire from concealed machine gun nests and artillery pieces that could withdraw into caves when threatened. The 5th Marine Depot Company landed on D-Day +1 with the mission of establishing supply lines from the beachhead to the advancing Marine infantry units. Jenkins and his fellow Black Marines worked tirelessly, unloading landing craft and carrying ammunition boxes across the exposed coral beaches under constant enemy fire. "We were losing men faster than we could replace them," recalled Major General William Rupertus, commander of the 1st Marine Division. "The Japanese had converted the entire island into a fortress, and our intelligence had severely underestimated their defensive positions." By the 3rd day of battle, the Marine advance had stalled before a series of ridges honeycombed with Japanese defensive positions. The terrain offered almost no cover for advancing troops, and attempts to move forward resulted in devastating casualties. Conventional tactics were failing, and the division commander was considering withdrawing some units to regroup. It was at this critical juncture that Jenkins's unique skills came to the fore. Captain Hardwick, now serving as operations officer for one of the infantry battalions, remembered the exceptional marksmanship of his former trainee. He located Jenkins among the depot company personnel and proposed a daring plan. "We need someone who can take out those machine gun nests on the ridge," Hardwick explained. "Our regular snipers can't get a clear shot because of the wind and the angles. Think you could do something about that?" Jenkins studied the ridge through binoculars. The Japanese had positioned their machine guns expertly, using the natural coral formations as protection. Direct fire was nearly impossible due to their concealment, and the gusting crosswinds made conventional sniping ineffective at the necessary range. "The wind's moving from left to right at about 25 miles per hour," Jenkins observed. "If I can get to that forward position near the base of the ridge, I might be able to work with it rather than against it." "Work with it?" Hardwick asked. "Yes, sir. Use the wind to bend the bullet's trajectory, aim off target, and let the wind carry the round where it needs to go." Hardwick looked skeptical. "That's not in any marksmanship manual I've ever read." "No, sir, it's not," Jenkins agreed, "but it works." Against regulations and at significant personal risk, Hardwick authorized Jenkins to attempt his unorthodox approach. Before dawn on September 17th, Jenkins and a spotter, Corporal Nathaniel Freeman from his depot company, crawled to an advanced position approximately 800 yards from the Japanese emplacements. The position they selected offered a clear line of sight to the ridge but provided minimal cover, just enough coral outcroppings to break up their silhouettes without obstructing their field of fire. As they settled into place, the first rays of dawn illuminated the battlefield before them. The ridge, already stained with the blood of countless Marines who had attempted to advance across the open ground, loomed like a fortress. "I need you to watch for any sign of movement," Jenkins instructed Freeman, "and keep track of the wind indicators at different distances." Freeman, who had worked with Jenkins during previous marksmanship sessions, understood the assignment. He focused his binoculars on various points between their position and the ridge, noting how vegetation moved in the wind and how dust particles drifted when disturbed. "Wind's about 15 miles per hour here," he reported, "but it's gusting to 25 near that outcropping midway to the target, and it seems to be swirling as it hits the ridge face." Jenkins absorbed this information, mentally constructing a three-dimensional map of the wind patterns. Unlike conventional snipers, who focused primarily on the average wind speed, he recognized that a bullet traveling through these complex air currents would follow a correspondingly complex path. "First target is that machine gun nest at the base of the ridge," Jenkins decided, indicating a barely visible position where occasional muzzle flashes had been spotted during the previous day's fighting. "Range 800 yards, but I'm going to aim at that dark spot of vegetation 17 degrees to the left. The wind will push the bullet into a curved trajectory that should bring it right into the cave opening." Freeman looked doubtful. "That's almost 30 yards off target at this range." "Watch and see," Jenkins replied, settling behind his rifle. He took 3 deep breaths, then held the third at half exhale. a technique that stabilized his position. His fingers squeezed the trigger with deliberate pressure, and the rifle cracked. Through his scope, Jenkins tracked the impact point by watching for dust or debris. There was nothing visible for a moment, then a brief flash of movement as a Japanese soldier fell forward from the concealed position. "Hit," Freeman confirmed through his binoculars. "Dead center." "How the hell did you do that?" "The bullet follows the path of least resistance," Jenkins explained, already adjusting his aim for the next target. "If you understand the forces acting on it, you can predict where it will go." What followed would later be described as one of the most remarkable displays of marksmanship in the history of warfare. Over the course of 6 hours, Jenkins systematically eliminated 9 Japanese machine gun positions and 23 individual enemy combatants. Each shot required complex calculations of wind speed, distance, and the precise angle of deflection needed to curve the bullet around the protective coral formations. He wasn't shooting at targets, Freeman would later testify. He was shooting at empty spaces, and somehow the bullets were finding their mark. "I've never seen anything like it before or since." Jenkins had developed what amounted to a new technique of sniping, one that embraced, rather than fought against, the natural forces affecting a bullet's path. By precisely measuring the wind's effect and calculating the exact point of aim needed to leverage that effect, he could place shots with extraordinary accuracy even when the target was partially protected by terrain features. His technique allowed him to accomplish what conventional snipers could not, neutralizing key Japanese positions that had halted the Marine advance. By mid-afternoon, the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines was able to move forward and secure a foothold on the ridge that had previously seemed impregnable. As darkness fell, Jenkins and Freeman made their way back to American lines. Captain Hardwick met them at a forward command post, his expression revealing both amazement and relief. "The battalion commander wants to know how you did it," he told Jenkins. "Those positions have been holding us up for 2 days, and suddenly they're silent." Jenkins explained his technique in simple terms, how he had mapped the wind patterns and deliberately aimed off target to achieve the necessary curved trajectory. Hardwick listened intently, occasionally interrupting with clarifying questions. "This could change everything," the captain said when Jenkins finished. "We need to get more marksmen using this approach immediately." Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commanding the 1st Regiment, received reports of the breakthrough with initial disbelief. When informed that a black Marine from a depot company had made it possible, he reportedly remarked, "I don't care if he's purple. Get that man to clear the rest of the ridge." For the next 3 days, Jenkins and a hastily assembled team of marksmen, both black and white, employed his technique to target Japanese positions across the battlefield. Jenkins provided brief training to the other snipers, teaching them the fundamentals of his wind drift calculations and showing them how to identify the optimal firing points for curved trajectories. "It's all about visualization," he explained to them. "You have to see the bullet's path in your mind before you pull the trigger. The wind isn't your enemy. It's another tool, like your scope or your rifle's sights." The training sessions were conducted in the field under combat conditions. Jenkins would first demonstrate a shot, then guide each sniper through the process of selecting an aiming point based on wind conditions. "Don't aim at where the target is," he instructed. "Aim at where you need the bullet to be when the wind takes hold of it." Not all were able to master the complex technique, but those who did became devastatingly effective. By September 21st, the Marine advance had regained momentum, with Jenkins's snipers eliminating key defensive positions ahead of the infantry units. One particularly crucial engagement occurred on September 23rd, when Japanese forces attempted a counterattack against the newly won American positions on the ridge. As enemy troops massed in a ravine before the assault, Jenkins and 3 other snipers who had adopted his technique targeted the Japanese officers. Using the swirling winds that funneled through the ravine, they placed shots that seemed to bend around the protective coral outcroppings that the Japanese had relied upon for cover. "The Japanese were completely demoralized," reported Lieutenant Harold Dunham, who observed the engagement. "Their officers were falling to shots that seemed to come from impossible angles, They couldn't understand how we were hitting them when they were sure they were protected by the terrain. The counterattack disintegrated before it could fully develop, saving dozens, if not hundreds, of American lives. This pattern repeated across the battlefield as Jenkins's technique was applied by more Marine marksmen. Major General Rupertus, initially skeptical of reports about the bent bullet technique, became a convert after observing Jenkins demonstrate the method. On September 25th, the general visited a forward position where Jenkins had established an impromptu sniper school for selected Marines from infantry units. "Show me," Rupertus commanded simply. Jenkins pointed out a Japanese observation post located in a crevice on a distant ridge, partially protected by an overhanging coral formation. "Conventional wisdom says this is an impossible shot, sir. The target is protected from direct fire, and the range is extreme." "So how would you take it?" the general asked. "I wouldn't shoot at it at all, sir," Jenkins replied. "I'd shoot here," he indicated a point well to the left of the target, "and let the wind carry the bullet in a curve that brings it under that overhang." Rupertus watched intently as Jenkins executed the shot exactly as described. Through spotting scopes, observers confirmed the elimination of the Japanese observer. "I've been in this corps for 30 years, Rupertus said afterward. "I've never seen anything like that. Get this technique to every sniper we have." The fighting on Peleliu would continue until November, but the breakthrough achieved by Jenkins's innovative technique had prevented what might have been an even more catastrophic stalemate. Military historians later estimated that his actions and the subsequent application of his method by other Marine snipers saved between 1,500 and 2,000 American lives by eliminating Japanese strongpoints that would otherwise have required costly frontal assaults. Yet despite this remarkable contribution, Jenkins's achievement remained largely unrecognized in official reports. Though Captain Hardwick submitted a recommendation for a Bronze Star with Combat V for valor, the paperwork mysteriously disappeared in the chain of command. The contributions of the 5th Marine Depot Company were noted only in general terms, with no specific mention of Jenkins's extraordinary marksmanship or his revolutionary technique. "The Negro race can well be proud of the work performed by the 5th Marine Depot Company," wrote Major General Rupertus in his after-action report. "Their wholehearted cooperation and untiring efforts demonstrated in every respect that they appreciated the privilege of wearing a Marine uniform." This was the extent of the official recognition, a patronizing acknowledgment that pointedly avoided mentioning individual heroism or innovation. Jenkins himself was never formally credited with developing what later generations of military marksmen would call the bent bullet technique. After Peleliu, Jenkins participated in 2 more major campaigns, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, continuing to employ his unorthodox sniping method when called upon. At Iwo Jima, the volcanic ash that covered the island created unique challenges for his technique. The fine particles, constantly disturbed by wind and combat, provided additional visual indicators of air movement that Jenkins incorporated into his calculations. Iwo was different from Peleliu, he later recalled. "The black sand showed wind patterns more clearly than any environment I'd ever worked in. You could actually see the currents in the air by watching how the ash moved." On February 23, 1945, the same day that Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi in the famous photograph that would symbolize the battle, Jenkins was positioned on the northern slope of the mountain. From this vantage point, he employed his curved trajectory technique to neutralize Japanese artillery spotters who were directing fire onto the American beach areas. The Japanese thought they were safe, tucked into those volcanic vents with only a narrow opening exposed, said Lieutenant James Wallace, who served as Jenkins's spotter that day. They couldn't conceive that someone could place a shot that would curve into those openings. But that's exactly what Jenkins did, over and over again. By the time the war ended in August 1945, Jenkins had accumulated an unofficial tally of 73 confirmed enemy kills, a number that would have placed him among the most accomplished snipers of the war had his achievements been officially recorded. Jenkins returned to the United States in October 1945 and was honorably discharged from the Marine Corps in January 1946. Like many black veterans, he discovered that the country he had fought for remained largely unchanged in its treatment of African Americans. The same segregated society that had existed before the war continued, with few acknowledging the sacrifices and contributions of black service members. He returned to Mississippi briefly, but found the environment stifling after his wartime experiences. Using the GI Bill, he enrolled at Howard University to complete his interrupted education, earning a degree in mechanical engineering in 1949. He subsequently moved to Detroit, where he found employment with an automotive company designing suspension systems, work that, ironically, applied some of the same principles of physics he had intuited on the battlefields of the Pacific. The curved path of a bullet through varying wind conditions isn't that different from calculating how a vehicle's suspension responds to changing road surfaces, Jenkins observed in a 1967 interview. Both involve understanding how external forces affect the movement of an object through space. Jenkins married Vivian Collier, a librarian he had met during his time at Howard, in 1951. They raised 3 children together, none of whom knew the full extent of their father's wartime accomplishments until decades later. Like many combat veterans, Jenkins rarely spoke of his experiences, deflecting questions with humble remarks about simply doing what needed to be done. "My father never talked about the war," his eldest son, Marcus, later recalled. "The only hint we had that he'd done something significant was a box of letters he kept from his Marine Corps captain, letters that spoke of his extraordinary contribution but never specified what that contribution was." In civilian life, Jenkins continued to refine his understanding of ballistics through competitive shooting. He joined a local rifle club in 1953, one of the few that accepted black members, and quickly distinguished himself in regional competitions. His approach to windage calculations, derived from his combat experience, frequently confused other competitive shooters who couldn't understand how he consistently outperformed them in windy conditions. He would take these shots that seemed completely wrong, remembered Harold Fisher, a fellow competitive shooter. His rifle would be aimed nowhere near the bullseye, and yet he'd hit center repeatedly. When asked how he did it, he'd just smile and say it was all about reading the wind. Jenkins's professional career progressed steadily through the 1950s and 60s. His expertise in mechanical engineering led to several patents related to automotive suspension systems and later to consulting work with defense contractors developing stabilization systems for vehicle-mounted weapons. Few of his colleagues knew that the theoretical models he developed were based on principles he had discovered through practical experience in combat. It wasn't until 1978 that Jenkins's contribution to military marksmanship began to receive recognition. A Marine Corps historian researching the Battle of Peleliu stumbled across mentions of Jenkins's technique in the personal papers of Captain Hardwick, who had died in 1962. Intrigued, the historian tracked down Jenkins, by then a retired engineer living in suburban Detroit, and recorded his account of the events. "I didn't invent anything new," Jenkins insisted during their interview. "I just applied what I already knew from hunting in Mississippi. The wind is going to move your bullet whether you want it to or not, so you might as well make it work for you instead of against you." The historian's subsequent article in the Marine Corps Gazette brought Jenkins's innovation to light for the first time, though even then it received only modest attention. It wasn't until the 1980s, when advanced ballistics and computer modeling confirmed the validity of Jenkins's technique, that the military sniper community fully appreciated the significance of his contribution. Dr. Gerald Ballard, a ballistics expert at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, conducted extensive computer simulations of Jenkins's technique in 1984. The results confirmed what Jenkins had discovered through intuition, that under certain wind conditions, a bullet could indeed be made to follow a curved trajectory that would allow it to reach targets protected from direct fire. What's remarkable is that Jenkins was calculating these complex ballistic trajectories in his head under combat conditions, Dr. Ballard noted in his report. Today we use sophisticated computer models to achieve the same results. He was literally decades ahead of his time. By then, many aspects of what Jenkins had done intuitively were being taught in formal sniper schools, though few instructors knew the origin of these methods. The bent bullet technique, refined and formalized, became part of the standard curriculum for military and law enforcement snipers worldwide, saving countless lives in subsequent conflicts. In 1989, Jenkins was invited to address a class at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School at Quantico, Virginia. At 68 years old, his hands were no longer steady enough for precision shooting, but his mind remained sharp as he explained the principles behind his technique to a new generation of Marine snipers. "The most important thing is to stop thinking of the wind as your enemy," he told them. "It's a force of nature that's going to affect your bullet no matter what you do. The secret is to understand exactly how it's going to affect it, and then use that understanding to your advantage." The students, initially skeptical that an elderly civilian could teach them anything about their craft, were quickly won over by Jenkins's detailed knowledge and practical demonstrations using ballistics modeling software. Several later reported that his presentation had fundamentally changed their approach to long-range shooting in windy conditions. In 1993, nearly 50 years after the Battle of Peleliu, the Marine Corps formally recognized Jenkins's contribution by inducting him into the Scout Sniper Association Hall of Fame, the first black Marine to receive this honor. The citation acknowledged his revolutionary approach to external ballistics under combat conditions and his exceptional courage in applying untested techniques during critical phases of battle. Jenkins, by then 72 years old and suffering from heart problems, accepted the honor with characteristic modesty. "I'm grateful that someone remembered," he said in his brief acceptance speech, "but I wasn't the only one out there making a difference. There were a lot of good men, black and white, who never got the recognition they deserved." 2 years later, in 1995, a more tangible recognition came when the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School at Quantico, Virginia, dedicated its advanced ballistics classroom as Jenkins Hall. A photograph of Sergeant Marcellus Jenkins taken on Peleliu in 1944 now hangs in the classroom where new generations of Marine snipers learn the principles he discovered through intuition and necessity. The dedication ceremony was attended by several high-ranking Marine Corps officers, including the Commandant, who spoke about the importance of recognizing innovations regardless of their source. "The Corps has not always been quick to acknowledge the contributions of all its members," the Commandant noted. "Today we take a small step toward rectifying that oversight." Also present at the ceremony were 4 Marines who had served with Jenkins on Peleliu and had learned his technique firsthand. Now elderly men themselves, they stood at attention as the classroom was dedicated, their presence a living testament to the impact of Jenkins's innovation. "He saved my life and the lives of countless others," said retired Master Sergeant Daniel Hayworth. "When our company was pinned down by Japanese fire from positions we couldn't even see, Jenkins and his team eliminated those threats one by one. They hit targets that should have been impossible to hit, using this technique that no one else had ever thought of." Jenkins passed away in April 2002 at the age of 81, survived by his wife, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. His funeral was attended by representatives from the Marine Corps Sniper Association and several active duty and retired Marine snipers who had benefited from his innovations, though they had never met the man himself. The eulogy, delivered by a Marine Corps colonel, focused not only on Jenkins's wartime achievements, but on the dignity with which he had faced both the challenges of combat and the injustices of his era. His legacy lives on in every Marine sniper who uses his techniques to save the lives of fellow Marines. In 2010, when the Marine Corps released its updated sniper training manual, the section on wind effects and curved trajectory shooting, included a formal acknowledgment of Jenkins's contribution. The principles outlined in this chapter were first demonstrated in combat by Sergeant Marcellus Jenkins, USMC, during the Battle of Peleliu in 1944. This simple sentence, buried in a technical manual, represents perhaps the most significant official recognition of an innovation that changed military marksmanship and saved thousands of lives. Sergeant Jenkins never received the formal recognition he deserved during his time in uniform, the colonel noted, yet he continued to serve his country and his corps by passing on his knowledge to those who came after him. In 2015, further validation came in the form of a detailed scientific study conducted at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. Using advanced computational fluid dynamics and modern ballistics modeling, researchers confirmed the mathematical principles underlying Jenkins's technique and expanded upon them to develop new applications for contemporary warfare. What's remarkable about Jenkins' method is that it anticipated concepts in external ballistics that wouldn't be formally described by physicists until decades later, noted Dr. Amara Wilson, the study's lead author. He intuitively grasped principles of aerodynamic drift and crosswind jump that most trained scientists of his era hadn't yet formalized. The study's findings were incorporated into training programs for military snipers across all branches of the armed forces, ensuring that Jenkins' innovation continues to influence modern warfare more than 70 years after he first demonstrated it on Peleliu. Today, Jenkins's legacy extends beyond military applications. His insights into ballistics and airflow have influenced fields ranging from meteorology to automotive aerodynamics. Engineers studying the behavior of objects moving through varying air currents frequently cite the Jenkins principle, the concept that environmental forces can be harnessed rather than merely compensated for. In 2020, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture added an exhibit dedicated to Jenkins and other Black Marines who served at Montford Point. The centerpiece of the exhibit is Jenkins' rifle scope, donated by his family, alongside interactive displays that demonstrate the principles of his bent bullet technique. The story of Marcellus Jenkins and his bent bullet technique offers profound lessons that extend far beyond military tactics. It illuminates the often overlooked contributions of Black service members during World War II, many of whom demonstrated exceptional courage and innovation despite serving in a segregated military that limited their opportunities for recognition. It also underscores how individual initiative and unorthodox thinking can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. When conventional approaches failed on Peleliu, Jenkins drew upon his unique background and experiences to develop a solution that others had not imagined possible. His willingness to challenge established doctrine, to see the wind as an ally rather than an obstacle, exemplifies the innovative spirit that has characterized American military success throughout history. Perhaps most importantly, Jenkins's story reminds us that heroism and innovation can emerge from unexpected sources when artificial barriers of race and prejudice are set aside, even temporarily, in the face of urgent necessity. The fact that his contribution remained unrecognized for decades reflects the persistent inequities of his era, but the eventual acknowledgement of his achievement represents a small measure of historical justice. The racial segregation that defined Jenkins's military service extended beyond the Marine Corps to all aspects of American society in the 1940s. The irony was not lost on many Black service members who fought for freedom abroad while being denied basic rights at home. Jenkins himself noted this contradiction in a letter to his wife written in 1945, shortly before his discharge. "I've spent 3 years fighting for a country that still treats me as less than a full citizen," he wrote. "Yet I don't regret my service. We fought not just for America as it is, but for America as it should be, as it might become." That transformation would begin, albeit slowly, in the years following World War II. President Harry Truman's Executive Order 9981, issued in 1948, officially desegregated the armed forces, though full implementation took years to achieve. The experiences of black veterans like Jenkins, who had proved their courage and capabilities in combat, helped build momentum for the civil rights movement that would fundamentally reshape American society in subsequent decades. For Jenkins personally, the post-war years brought both opportunities and continued challenges. The GI Bill provided educational benefits that might otherwise have been unattainable, opening doors to professional advancement. Yet discrimination remained a constant reality, limiting where he could live, work, and socialize. My engineering degree qualified me for senior positions that I was never even considered for, he noted in 1971. But I focused on the work itself, rather than the title or the pay. The satisfaction of solving complex problems was its own reward. This attitude, focusing on contribution rather than recognition, characterized Jenkins' approach to both his military service and his civilian career. It reflected a resilience born of growing up in the segregated South, where expectations of fairness or acknowledgement were luxuries rarely afforded to black Americans. Today, military snipers from countries around the world study principles derived from Jenkins' intuitive understanding of ballistics. Modern technological advances like laser rangefinders, ballistic computers, and advanced scopes have refined and extended his techniques, but the fundamental insight remains unchanged, understanding and leveraging environmental factors rather than merely compensating for them. In advanced sniper courses, instructors still occasionally refer to the Jenkins principle, the concept that mastery comes not from fighting against natural forces, but from incorporating them into one strategy. Modern snipers, equipped with the sophisticated technology that Jenkins could only have dreamed of, continue to apply his insights when engaging targets under challenging wind conditions. The coral ridges of Peleliu, once soaked with the blood of American Marines and Japanese defenders, are now overgrown with tropical vegetation. The island, part of the nation of Palau, has become a destination for historical tourism, with guided tours of the battlefield sites. Few visitors, however, hear the story of how a black Marine's unconventional thinking helped break the stalemate that threatened to make the battle even more costly than it ultimately became. In 2017, a small memorial was established near the base of the ridge where Jenkins first demonstrated his technique. The plaque, dedicated by a group of Marine Corps veterans, bears a simple inscription. On this ground in September 1944, Sergeant Marcellus Jenkins of the 5th Marine Depot Company changed the art of military marksmanship forever. His innovative bent bullet technique saved countless Marine lives and exemplified the highest traditions of ingenuity under fire. As we reflect on the sacrifices made by the greatest generation during World War II, we must remember that their ranks included Americans of all races and backgrounds, many of whom served with distinction despite facing discrimination both in and out of uniform. Sergeant Marcellus Jenkins represents countless others whose contributions were overlooked in their time, but whose impact reverberates through history nonetheless. In 2021, when asked about the significance of Jenkins's legacy, Marine Corps Master Sergeant Darius Powell, an instructor at the Scout Sniper School, offered this assessment. Every time one of our snipers uses wind deflection to reach a target that would otherwise be inaccessible, they're building on what Jenkins discovered through intuition and courage. He didn't just develop a technique, he changed how we think about the fundamental relationship between the sniper, the bullet, and the environment. Would you have broken conventional wisdom or obeyed it? Would you have had the courage to attempt something untested when lives hung in the balance? And would you have persevered despite knowing your achievements might go unrecognized due to the color of your skin? These are the questions that Jenkins' story poses to each of us. In a world still struggling with prejudice and division, his example reminds us that innovation knows no color, courage wears no particular uniform, and human potential flourishes most fully when artificial barriers are removed. Share this story so others will remember what real courage means: the courage to think differently, to persevere despite injustice, and to serve a cause greater than oneself, even when that service goes unrecognized. In doing so, we honor not just Sergeant Marcellus Jenkins, but all those whose contributions to our shared history have too long remained in the shadows. The bent bullet technique that saved 2,000 Marines on a distant Pacific island teaches us that sometimes the most powerful innovation comes not from fighting against the prevailing winds, but from understanding how to make them carry you toward your target.